one house in Hampshire. Elizabeth and Philip spent the first nights of their marriage inside it. 34 years later, Charles and Diana began their honeymoon in the same rooms. In the years between, a prince who leaned on the man who owned the house was steered, encouraged, and given a private place to love a woman he could not keep. The man who arranged so much of it was killed by a bomb on his own boat before he could see how any of it ended. Broadlands looks like every other great English house, serene, columned, mirrored in a slow river. But behind that calm front, the marriages that shaped the modern monarchy were not fallen into. They were made here, under one roof, by one uncle nobody could refuse. If you enjoy the stories the history books leave in the margins, subscribe and stay with this one. The house at the centre of it kept its secrets far longer than the people who lived inside it. Chapter 1. The house that outlived its own kind. Along the River Test, a pale classical house stands exactly as it did 2 centuries ago, and that survival is the first clue. It sits low in its park, south of the little market town of Romsey, in the green heart of Hampshire. The River Test slides past the lawns, clear and slow, famous among fishermen the world over. The house is Palladian, which is to say built to the calm, classical rules the 18th century loved. Pale yellow brick, dressed with pale Portland stone, a great columned portico facing the water. There is nothing threatening about it. It does not loom on a hill like a fortress. It rests in its landscape as though it had grown there, the very picture of settled English grandeur. That picture is a kind of lie, and the house has been telling it for a long time. Start with the thing that makes Broadlands rare. It is a survivor. Across the 20th century, the great houses of England fell in their thousands. Some were pulled down for the value of their lead and their stone. Some were gutted by fire and never rebuilt. Some were handed to the nation because no family could afford to keep them standing. In the worst years of the demolition, a country house was lost every few days. Whole worlds of plaster and portrait and panelling carted off and sold. The England of great private houses that had lasted for centuries came apart inside a single lifetime. Broadlands survived. It stands today as it stood before the wars, private, perfect, lived in. And the reason it survived is the reason this whole story is possible. The land here is old. It belonged to Romsey Abbey in the Saxon and medieval centuries, church land worked by church tenants. When King Henry VIII broke the monasteries in the 1530s and seized their wealth, the estate passed into private hands, moving through the Fleming and the St. Barbe families across the generations. Then, in 1736, it was bought by Henry Temple, the first Viscount Palmerston, and the Temple family began the slow work of turning a manor into a masterpiece. The house that stands now is essentially the creation of the 1760s and 1770s. The second Viscount Palmerston inherited an older building of Tudor and Jacobean bones, and he wanted something in the modern taste. In 1767, he called in the most sought-after man in England for such work, Lancelot Brown, the landscape designer everyone knew as Capability Brown. Brown did to Broadlands what he did across the country. He swept away the old formal gardens. He opened the park to the river. He made a landscape of smooth turf and scattered trees and shining water that looks entirely natural and is entirely invented, composed as carefully as a painting. The architect Henry Holland, Brown's son-in-law and partner, finished the house itself, refacing and reshaping it into the serene classical box that survives. Inside, the great rooms run one into the next in the Georgian manner, a sculpture hall, a saloon, drawing rooms hung with family faces. It was a house built to impress without shouting, to say power in a quiet voice. Walk the ground floor, and the effect is deliberate. The rooms open one into another in a long chain, a sculpture hall giving onto a saloon, the saloon onto drawing rooms, each hung with the faces of the family, and, in the years to come, crowded with the naval and imperial trophies of the man who would make the house famous. Tall windows pull the light off the water. The River Test, one of the great chalk streams of England and among the most prized fishing rivers anywhere in the world, runs bright and slow across the park that Brown composed. And the house sits inside that green invention as though nature had arranged itself around it. Everything about the place was made to feel effortless, inevitable, permanent. Everything about it was, in truth, the product of enormous effort and enormous cost. And that is the first small lesson Broadlands teaches. Permanence is a thing that has to be paid for, and it had to be paid for without pause. A house of this scale did not simply sit there. It consumed. It demanded roofs kept sound, and rooms kept warm, and a small army of people to run it, year upon year, whatever the weather of the age outside. In the 18th and early 19th centuries, when the land still paid, an estate like this could carry itself on its rents and its farms. But that world was ending even as the house reached its most beautiful. The long agricultural depression of the late 19th century broke the old bond between land and wealth. The taxes and the wars of the 20th century finished it. By the time the Ashley family held Broadlands, a great house that lived on land alone was a house living on borrowed time, and the clock was already running. Its most famous early master was Henry John Temple, the third Viscount Palmerston, twice Prime Minister to Queen Victoria in the middle of the 19th century, one of the towering political figures of his age. He lived here. He died here in 1865. For a time, Broadlands was one of the addresses where England was governed, and the ghost of that old political grandeur never quite left the rooms. But in time, the house left the direct Temple line and passed down through the family into the hands of the Ashley family. By the early 20th century, it belonged to Wilfrid Ashley, a member of Parliament later raised to the peerage as Baron Mount Temple. And Wilfrid Ashley had a daughter. Her name was Edwina. She would carry into this quiet classical house a fortune large enough to defy the century that was about to destroy houses exactly like it. She would marry a man with a plan for a dynasty, and between them, they would begin to use Broadlands for something no architect had ever drawn. The house was ready. It had been made beautiful, made calm, made to last. What it had not yet been made into was a machine. That would come with the heiress, and the heiress was about to walk through the door. Chapter 2. The heiress who carried a fortune through the door. When a 20-year-old woman married a naval officer in 1922, she brought a bank into a house that lived on land. Her name was Edwina Cynthia Annette Ashley, born in 1901, the elder daughter of Wilfrid Ashley of Broadlands. On her father's side, she was Old English gentry, land and parliament, and a great house by a river. But it was her mother's side that changed everything, because Edwina's grandfather was Sir Ernest Cassel, and Sir Ernest Cassel was one of the richest men in Edwardian Britain. Cassel was a German-born financier who had come to England with almost nothing and built one of the great fortunes of the age. He became the closest money man and personal friend of King Edward VII, so close that the King's Circle and Cassel's Circle were often the same rooms. He financed railways and mines and loans to governments. When he died in 1921, he left an estate estimated in the low tens of millions of pounds, at a time when the whole scale of English money was smaller than a modern mind expects. Edwina was his favourite grandchild, and she was his principal heir. On his death, she came into the largest single share of that fortune. The figures that survive place her personal inheritance in the region of £2,300,000, with more held in trust to follow. She was 20 years old. The Cassel fortune had been built inside a single lifetime, and its scale is worth laying out. Sir Ernest Cassel had come to England as a young man with almost nothing and a rare gift for money. He financed railways and mines across continents and lent to governments, and he became so close to King Edward VII that the two were spoken of in the same breath, the king and his banker. At his death, the fortune he left was estimated in the low tens of millions of pounds, made not from centuries of inherited acres, but from ledgers and loans and nerve. Edwina's share of it made her one of the wealthiest young women in Britain before she was old enough to have earned a shilling of it. The money had crossed, in 2 generations, from a city counting house into the oldest kind of English grandeur. It was about to cross once more, through a wedding, into a house by a river. There is a bitter symmetry in this that the film should mark. All across England, families whose names went back to the conquest were watching their estates crumble because the land no longer paid, selling their pictures and pulling down their wings and letting their staff go. And here was a house rescued by exactly the kind of new money the old families had always looked down on. Banking money, city money, the money of a man who had started with nothing. The bluest blood in the land could not save its houses. A financier's granddaughter could, and did. That figure is hard to feel from a distance, so set it against the wages of the time. In the early 1920s, a housemaid in a great country house earned perhaps £20 to £30 a year with her bed and her board. A butler at the very top of domestic service might earn £60 to £100. A skilled working man in a town kept a wife and children on £2 or £3 a week and counted himself fortunate. Against those figures, an inheritance of more than £2 million belonged to a different order of existence. It was money that could not be spent down in a lifetime of trying, money that generated more money while its owner slept. That was the fortune that came to Broadlands, and it came through a wedding. The naval officer was Lord Louis Mountbatten, known to his family and soon to the world as Dickie. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, a cousin of the royal family, handsome, ambitious, and, by the standards of his royal relatives, not rich at all. Grand blood ran in his veins, but grand blood did not pay for the life he intended to lead. Edwina had the opposite problem and the opposite gift. She had more money than almost anyone in England and a hunger for a life larger than a country drawing room. They married on the 18th of July, 1922, at St. Margaret's, the church beside Westminster Abbey where fashionable London married. It was one of the social events of the year, a crush of royalty and rank. The photographs show a golden couple at the centre of their world. And with that wedding, the money and the house came together. Broadlands would now be sustained not by its fields and its rents, which the coming century would strangle, but by a fortune made in the City of London and spread across the globe. This is the single most important financial fact of the entire story. The house survived the 20th century because it stopped depending on the 20th century. While its neighbours were broken by death duties and falling rents and the long decline of the land, Broadlands had a bank behind it. That security bought more than roofs and wages. It bought freedom. It bought the ability to entertain on any scale, to keep any number of staff, to open the doors to the most powerful people in the land and to close them again on whatever happened inside. It bought privacy, which is the rarest luxury of all, and privacy is what turned a beautiful house into a useful one. For now, the young Mountbattens were simply the most glittering couple in England, rich beyond reason, connected to the throne, masters of a perfect house by a perfect river. The world saw a fairy tale. The world, as it so often did with this house, was seeing only the front of the building. Behind it, the marriage that had just brought all this wealth through the door was already a stranger thing than anyone outside was allowed to know. Chapter 3. A marriage behind the marriage. The most glamorous couple in England kept a secret behind the glamour, an arrangement they never let the world see. From the outside, Lewis and Edwina Mountbatten were the perfect modern marriage, beautiful, rich, devoted, forever photographed stepping from cars and boarding ships and standing on the steps of their house. Inside, according to the serious biographers who have studied their lives, the marriage was something more complicated and, for its time, more daring. It was, in effect, an open arrangement. Both partners, over the years, lived a good deal of their private lives apart. Both formed attachments outside the marriage, and both, through all of it, kept the shared front intact. This must be said carefully, because it is the kind of claim gossip loves to run ahead of the evidence. What the record supports, and what her biographers describe, is a marriage of two strong-willed and independent people who came, over time, to an understanding. They would not pretend to a conventional union. They would live largely as they chose, and they would remain, in public and in their own strange loyalty, husband and wife. Edwina was restless from the start. She had grown up with a dead mother, a distant father, and a colossal fortune, a combination that can leave a young woman both free and unanchored. In the 1920s, she flung herself into the fast, bright, pleasure-seeking world of rich society between the wars, travel, and parties, and a glamour that the newspapers followed hungrily. Lewis, for his part, was consumed by his naval career and by his own ambitions, forever pushing, forever climbing, forever managing his own image with a care that struck even his friends as excessive. So the house filled, in these years, with a particular kind of life. House parties at Broadlands, guests drawn from royalty and politics and the moneyed edges of both, the film and the fashion of the age brushing against the oldest blood in the country. And beneath the surface, two people conducting their own affairs, while the household staff, discreet by training and by necessity, saw everything and said nothing. Here is the pattern this house would repeat for 60 years. One face turned to the world, calm and correct and grand. Another life lived behind it, hidden by walls and by money and by the trained blindness of servants. The gap between the two was not a flaw in the house. It became its function. Look at the servants themselves, the people who made the front possible. A house of this size ran on a large staff arranged in an order as rigid as the navy Louis loved. At the top stood the butler and the housekeeper, and beneath them a descending world of footmen and ladies' maids, a cook and her kitchen maids, hall boys and scullery maids and housemaids, and outdoors the gardeners and gamekeepers and grooms. The whole system was designed around a single principle, that the people who did the work should not be seen doing it. They used their own back stairs and their own passages. They lit the fires before the family woke. They were expected, in the great phrase of English service, to be neither seen nor heard. A house like this was built to hide its workings, and a household trained to hide its workings will hide a great deal more than dust. That is the quiet genius of a great English house as an instrument. It came ready, made with discretion. The whole apparatus that kept the family's comfort invisible, the back stairs and the service passages, and the servants schooled to look through their masters as though they were glass, could just as easily keep a secret as keep a fire. A footman who has been trained never to repeat what he hears at dinner is a footman who will never repeat what he hears through a bedroom door. The machinery of privilege and the machinery of privacy were the same machinery. And in a house where two people had agreed to live parallel lives behind a single public face, that machinery was worth more than all the pictures on the walls. The world outside saw only the golden couple. It saw Edwina stepping from an aeroplane in the latest fashion, Louis in his gold braid on the deck of a ship, the pair of them photographed at every fashionable event of the season. What the world did not see, it was never meant to see, and the house made sure it never did. The gap between the bright public image and the complicated private truth was not an accident that the family managed to survive. It was, increasingly, the thing the house was for. Edwina found her purpose in the end, though it came late. In the Second World War, she threw herself into relief and welfare work with a fierce energy that surprised those who had known only the party girl. Later, when Louis became the last Viceroy of India, she worked among the sick and the displaced of a subcontinent tearing itself apart, and her closeness there to the Indian leader Jawaharlal Nehru became one of the most discussed friendships of the century, an intimacy the sources describe as deep and genuine and leave, honestly, at that. She died in 1960, worn out by the work she had at last found worth doing. But all of that lay ahead. In the bright years between the wars, the template was set. Broadlands was a house that could hold two truths at once, a public marriage and a private one, and keep them both behind the same calm columns. The man at the centre of it was learning something in these years, something he would use for the rest of his life. He was learning that a great house, with money enough and discretion enough, could be more than a home. It could be a stage. It could be a workshop. It could be a place where the private business of a dynasty was done, out of sight, under control. And Louis Mountbatten had already fixed his eyes on the greatest piece of dynastic business in the land. He had a nephew, and he had a plan. Chapter 4. The Uncle Who Decided a Queen. Before Broadlands made a honeymoon, the man who owned it made a match that would decide the throne. What Louis Mountbatten did makes sense only through what he believed about himself. He was a great-grandson of Queen Victoria, born into the outer circle of European royalty in 1900. His family had been grand and German, and in the First World War, the German name had become a liability, so the royal relatives anglicised themselves, and Battenberg became Mountbatten. Louis never forgot the sting of being made to feel not quite central, not quite grand enough, and out of that sting grew a lifelong project. He would make himself indispensable to the royal family. He would become the man they could not do without. He was charming, energetic, vain, and relentlessly ambitious, a naval officer who managed his own career and his own legend with equal care. But beneath the vanity ran something real, a genuine and consuming devotion to the future of the dynasty he was attached to. He thought about the royal family the way a chess player thinks about a board, several moves ahead, and he was never shy of reaching out a hand to move the pieces. By the middle of the century, he had climbed to the very top of the Royal Navy and served as the last Viceroy of India. He had governed a subcontinent and stood at the elbow of kings. And yet, for all his rank, what he wanted most was something rank alone could not give him: a permanent place at the heart of the royal family itself, woven in by blood and marriage so tightly that he could never again be made to feel like an outsider. Public office would end, titles would pass. But a marriage bound families together across the generations, and a man who arranged the right marriages could write himself into the story of a dynasty forever. That was the prize. That was what he was playing for, on the board only he could see. His finest piece was his nephew. Prince Philip of Greece and Denmark was the son of Louis's sister, a boy of royal blood and almost no money, shuttled through a broken childhood across Europe. Louis effectively took him in hand, guided his education, steered him into the Royal Navy, and shaped him into a young man who might be useful. And Louis saw, earlier than most, exactly how useful his handsome, penniless, royal nephew might become. There was a girl. She was the heir to the British throne. Princess Elizabeth, elder daughter of King George VI, was still a child when the connection began to form, and Philip, a young naval cadet, when she first fixed her attention on him. What followed has been told many times as a simple love story, and there was real love in it. But threaded through the romance was the quiet, constant work of an uncle who understood exactly what a marriage between his nephew and the future queen would mean, for the boy, for the family, and for himself. He encouraged. He arranged meetings. He smoothed the path. He promoted the match with all the skill he brought to a naval campaign. There were obstacles. Philip was foreign-born, poor, and connected to a Greek royal house that had been repeatedly thrown off its throne. Parts of the court and the establishment were cool, but the young princess had made up her mind, and behind her stood an uncle by marriage who had made up his mind years before. In 1947, the engagement was announced. Philip renounced his Greek and Danish royal titles, was received into the Church of England, took the surname Mountbatten from his mother's family, and, on the eve of the wedding, was created Duke of Edinburgh by the king. In a single stroke, the penniless foreign prince became a British duke married to the heir to the throne, and the name Mountbatten was carried to the very threshold of the crown. Look closely at how it was done, because the method is the man. Mountbatten did not force the match, and he did not need to, for there was real feeling between the young people. What he did was quieter and cleverer than force. He put the pieces where the story could happen. He arranged the meetings. He kept his nephew close and well placed. He smoothed the objections and worked the family from the inside. It was the technique he would use for the rest of his life, and it is the technique that made his house so useful. A man who understands that you shape a marriage by shaping the circumstances around it will always want a private place where those circumstances can be arranged. He had such a place, on the River Test. His nephew had married the future queen. The name he had chosen for himself in the dark days of the First World War now stood beside the oldest throne in Europe, and a boy he had rescued from a rootless childhood would father the next king. For a man whose whole life was a campaign to make himself indispensable to the royal family, no victory was ever sweeter, and none would matter more. The psychology here explains everything the house was about to be used for. Mountbatten did not see marriage as a private matter to be left to the hearts of the young. He saw it as the most important instrument a family possessed, too important to be left to chance. Marriages made alliances. Marriages made heirs. Marriages made or broke the standing of a dynasty across generations. A man who thought this way, and who happened to own a great and private house, would find an obvious use for it. Because a wedding is a public act, performed in an abbey before the world. But a honeymoon is private. A honeymoon needs walls and grounds and gates, and a household trained to see nothing. A honeymoon needs a house exactly like Broadlands, owned by a man exactly like Mountbatten, at exactly the moment his greatest match came to its consummation. He had made the marriage. Now he would lend the rooms, and the most important couple in the country would begin their life together inside his walls, with the whole of Britain pressing at the gate to see. Chapter 5. The Honeymoon Behind the Gates. In November 1947, the heir to the throne began her married life inside her uncle's house, and the country tried to climb the walls. The wedding came first, on the 20th of November 1947, at Westminster Abbey. It was a burst of colour and hope in a Britain worn grey by war and rationing. The country was cold, broke and tired, still counting its dead and queuing for its bread. And here was a princess in white and a naval prince at the altar, a fairy tale offered to a people who badly needed one. Millions listened on the wireless. The crowds filled the freezing streets. For one day the drabness lifted, and then the newlyweds left London for the first part of their honeymoon, and they went to Broadlands, lent to them by Uncle Dicky. The choice was not a small thing, and it was not an accident. Of all the houses in England the young couple might have gone to, they went to Mountbatten's. It placed the most important marriage in the country inside his home, under his roof, and, in a quiet way, under his patronage. The house that Edwina's fortune had saved and Louis's ambition had made into a stage now held the future Queen of England on her wedding night. But privacy, even here, was already under siege. The marriage of the heir to the throne was the most watched event in the world, and Broadlands, for all its walls and its river and its trained discretion, could not entirely keep the world out. Crowds gathered. Photographers pressed toward the estate, desperate for a single frame of the couple. When the newlyweds attended the parish church at Romsey on the Sunday, the scenes became almost a siege, sightseers straining and jostling for a glimpse of a private moment made public by the sheer weight of a nation's curiosity. It is easy to forget how much the country needed that glimpse. In the winter of 1947, Britain was on its knees. The war had been won 2 years before, but victory had left the nation exhausted and broke, its cities scarred, its people worn thin by years of fear and loss. Rationing was harsher in some ways than it had been during the fighting. Bread was rationed, fuel was short. The coming winter would be one of the coldest in memory, and the country was cold and grey and tired to its bones. Into that greyness came a royal wedding, a burst of white and gold and ceremony, a fairy tale offered to people who had almost forgotten what one looked like. No wonder they pressed at the gates of Broadlands. The couple inside were carrying, whether they wished to or not, the hopes of a battered country for something bright. And the house held them through it. Behind its walls, for a few days, the heir to the throne and her new husband could be, as much as any royal couple ever can, simply a young married pair at the start of a life. The columns kept the crowds at a distance. The park gave them air. The trained silence of the household gave them peace. Broadlands did for Elizabeth and Philip exactly what a great private house was supposed to do. It made a wall between two people and a watching world. And on the far side of that wall, a marriage began that would outlast almost everyone who stood at the gate. Even in 1947, even inside a great private estate lent by a powerful man, the royal couple could not be fully hidden. The pressure of the public eye was already leaning against the walls. It was a crowd, still, human and clumsy and on foot. It was not yet the industrial machine of the world press with its long lenses and its aircraft. But the direction was set. 34 years later, when another royal honeymoon began in this same house, the leaning of that eye would have become a hunt. Something stood over the whole scene, invisible to the crowds. In 1947, the man whose house this was, the man who had made the marriage, was at the absolute summit of his life. Louis Mountbatten was Viceroy of India, the last one, presiding that very year over the end of British rule across the subcontinent and the birth of 2 new nations. He was, at that moment, one of the most powerful men on earth, holding the fate of hundreds of millions in his hands, while also, quietly, lending his Hampshire drawing rooms to the heir of the British throne for her wedding night. Few private houses in history could claim so direct a line into the centre of world power. Broadlands could claim it because of the man who owned it, and the man who owned it was at his zenith. The honeymoon at Broadlands gave way to its later stages, and the young couple began the marriage that would, of all the marriages in this story, prove the one clear success. Elizabeth and Philip stayed married for 73 years, until his death, a partnership that anchored a reign of extraordinary length. The house had helped begin something that lasted, and that success is precisely why the house became so dangerous a thing to imitate. Because a precedent had been set. Broadlands was now, in the private law of the royal family, the place where a great marriage began. It had worked once, spectacularly. It had launched a queen. When the next generation came to marry, and came looking for a blessing, for a borrowed piece of that magic, they would know exactly which house to go to. The rooms had done their work. The marriage held. And the legend of Broadlands as a maker of royal marriages, a lucky house, a blessed house, took root in the family's memory, waiting for the day it would be tested by a couple far less suited to survive it. But that test was decades away. First, the house would take on a different role, quieter and stranger. It would become the refuge of a lonely boy who would one day be king, and the private classroom in which his uncle would teach him the hardest and most damaging lessons of his life. Chapter 6. The grandfather he never had. A lonely boy who would be king found in the owner of this house the one man who seemed to understand him. Prince Charles was born in 1948, the year after his parents married, the son of Elizabeth and Philip, and the heir to the throne after his mother. He grew into a shy, sensitive, easily wounded boy, ill at ease with his brisk and demanding father, often distant from a mother whose duties swallowed her time. He was a child who felt things deeply in a family that prized the stiff upper lip, and he was frequently, achingly, alone. Into that loneliness stepped his great-uncle. Louis Mountbatten, uncle to Philip, was a kind of honorary grandfather to Charles, and Charles came to love him with a depth he gave to few other people. Mountbatten had time for the boy. He listened. He talked to him for hours about history and the navy and the mysteries of monarchy, subjects the old man loved and the young one drank in. Charles would later describe him, in a phrase that says everything, as the grandfather he never had. And the place where much of this bond was formed was Broadlands. Charles came often to the house by the test. He fished the famous river. He shot over the estate. He sat late into the evening with the old man, talking. In the calm of those Hampshire rooms, the shy prince found something he found almost nowhere else, an older figure who took him seriously, who flattered him, who made him feel understood and important and safe. Broadlands became his refuge, the house he could come to and be, for a while, simply happy. Picture the two of them there in the long summer evenings, the old sailor and the young prince, walking the banks of the Test as the light went gold on the water. Mountbatten talked, and Charles listened, and the talk ranged over everything the boy would need to know: the history of the family, the duties of a king, the character of the men and women who had worn the crown. To the prince, it felt like love, and in part it was. To the old man, it was love too, but it was also instruction, the passing down of a lifetime's certainty to the one person who would one day sit at the very centre of everything Mountbatten cared about. The river ran on. The prince drank it in, and a bond formed in those evenings that would shape the rest of his life, for good and for ill. There is a real tenderness in this, and the film should not flinch from it. The relationship between the old sailor and the young prince was genuine on both sides. Mountbatten adored the boy and delighted in his company. Charles trusted him as he trusted almost no one. For a young man raised in the cold grandeur of the palace, Broadlands and its master offered warmth, attention, and the illusion, at least, of being loved for himself. The bond deepened through the 1960s and into the 70s as Charles grew from a sensitive boy into a sensitive young man. Mountbatten had by then made himself the grand old sage of the whole royal family, the keeper of its history, and, as he saw it, the guardian of its future. He had opinions on everything, and he was never slow to share them. To a young heir uncertain of his path, that certainty was intoxicating. Here was a man who had known the great figures of the century, who had governed an empire, who spoke of kings and wars and destiny as though he had a personal hand in all of them, and who now turned that whole dazzling attention onto a shy prince and told him he mattered. Charles drank it in. He came to rely on his great-uncle's judgment above almost anyone's, and the setting for so much of it was the house by the river. Broadlands was where the prince could put down the weight of being the heir and simply be a young man who liked to fish and talk. He knew the water. He knew the rooms. He knew that here, at least, he was welcome for himself, and not merely for the crown he would one day wear. It became, in the truest sense, his sanctuary. That is what makes the shadow over the relationship so dark, because the man who offered the sanctuary was also the man with the plan, and the sanctuary was also the workshop. But there is a shadow in it too, and the shadow is the whole point, because Louis Mountbatten did not love without a purpose. He was, as he had always been, a man who thought several moves ahead, who saw the royal family as a board and marriage as the most important move on it. And now, the most important piece on that board was a boy who loved him and trusted him and would take his advice above almost anyone's. Mountbatten had helped make the marriage that produced this heir. He fully intended to shape the marriage the heir would make in his turn. The old man had views on how a prince should live before he married, and views on whom a prince should marry in the end, and a plan, quietly forming, that would have bound the royal family and his own family together for another generation. He had a granddaughter. He had a great house. He had the complete trust of the future king. And he had, as always, a plan. The psychology of the two men fitted together with a terrible neatness. Charles needed a guide, a father who was not his father, a source of certainty in a life of confusing duty. Mountbatten needed a project, an heir to shape, a last great piece of dynastic work to set beside the match he had made in 1947. The boy offered his trust. The old man offered his certainty. And in the exchange, the boy handed over something dangerous, the right to be told how to love. The lessons were coming. Some would be given in conversation, in the long evenings by the river. One would be given in a letter, set down in the old man's own hand. And that letter would read less like advice than like a set of orders. It would tell a prince to take his pleasures where he found them, and to save his heart for a suitable girl chosen later. And the house that had sheltered the boy would now shelter the affair that letter helped to license. Chapter 7. The letter that told a prince how to love. In 1974, the old man wrote his great-nephew a letter about women, and it read like a set of orders. By the early 1970s, Charles was a young man, out of university, an officer in the Royal Navy like his great-uncle before him, and beginning the romantic life of a prince in his 20s. And his great-uncle had firm ideas about how that life should go. In February 1974, Mountbatten wrote to Charles with advice that has since become notorious. A man in Charles's position, the old man counselled, should sow his wild oats and have as many affairs as he could before settling down. He should enjoy his freedom while he had it. And then, at the right time, he should choose to marry a suitable, attractive, and sweet-charactered girl, one the family and the country could accept. Pleasure first, the letter said in effect, and a suitable marriage later. And do not confuse the two. It was worldly advice, and in its way it was practical. The counsel of an experienced man to a young one about the double standard of their world. But it was also a kind of license, handed to a romantic and impressionable young man by the person he trusted most. It told him that his own heart could be indulged now and overruled later, and it helped set in motion the central tragedy of his life. There is something almost cruel in the logic of it, seen from the far side of everything that followed. The old man was teaching the young one to divide love from marriage, to treat the first as a pleasure to be taken, and the second as a duty to be performed, and to keep the two in separate rooms of the heart. It was the code of his own world, and in its way, of his own marriage, the arrangement behind the arrangement that Broadlands had always sheltered. But a code that works for a hard, worldly old sailor may be poison to a romantic and thin-skinned young prince. Charles was not built to love lightly and marry coldly. He would try to follow the code, and in the trying, he would break 3 lives, his own among them. Around this same period, Charles had met a young woman named Camilla Shand. Here the record must be handled with care, because a great deal of myth has grown over the truth. It is often said, loosely, that Charles and Camilla met at Broadlands. The serious biographical record does not support that, and this film will not claim it. The accounts of their first meeting differ. Some place it around 1970 at a polo match at Windsor. The royal biographer Sally Bedell Smith dates it to the summer of 1972, after Charles returned from his first naval tour, and says plainly that they were introduced by a mutual friend, Lucia Santa Cruz, the daughter of a Chilean diplomat, and that the frequently repeated date of 1971 is simply wrong. What every serious account agrees on is that the meeting happened within their own social circle, on the polo field, and in the hunting country, and not in the drawing rooms of Broadlands. So what, then, did Broadlands actually do? This is where the truth is stronger than the myth. Mountbatten allowed his great-nephew to use Broadlands as a private place, away from the newspapers and the cameras. And Mountbatten, the man who had told Charles to have his affairs before marrying a suitable girl, encouraged the young prince's romantic life along exactly those lines. The house was the discreet setting, the place with walls and gates and a household trained to say nothing, where a prince could conduct a relationship out of the public eye. Broadlands was where, under the old man's approving hand, the couple could be together unseen. The introduction belonged to their own world. The private walls and the encouragement belonged to Broadlands and its master. There was a complication, and her name was already spoken for. Camilla was involved with a dashing cavalry officer named Andrew Parker Bowles, an on-again attachment that ran alongside her growing closeness to the prince. And there was another complication, buried in the old man's own plans. Because even as Mountbatten was lending the house and blessing the freedom, he had a different marriage in mind for Charles in the end. He hoped the prince would eventually marry his own granddaughter, Amanda Knatchbull, binding the Mountbatten line directly into the succession, the final and grandest piece of his lifelong project. He even worked toward a trip that might throw the two young people together. It never came off. And so the first chapter of the great love of Charles's life closed almost before it had opened. In 1973, Camilla married Andrew Parker Bowles. Charles went off to his naval duties at sea. The suitable girl the old man had prescribed had not yet appeared, and the unsuitable woman the prince actually wanted was now another man's wife. He would carry that loss quietly for years. The woman he had wanted did not vanish from his life so much as move to its edges, married, settled, always somewhere near. And the prince learned the first hard truth of his great-uncle's code, that a heart told to wait does not simply obey. It waits, but it does not forget. and one day it comes back to collect what it believes it is owed. The house had sheltered the beginning of an attachment that could not, under the rules Mountbatten himself lived by, be allowed to become a marriage. The old man had built a plan for a century. He had made a queen, shaped an heir, licensed the heir's freedom, and lined up his own granddaughter for the throne. Everything was arranged. The house could be saved, and had been. Whether the human hearts inside it could be arranged as neatly was a question the old man never doubted, and never lived to see answered. Because within a few short years, on a bright morning off the coast of Ireland, the man who arranged everything would be arranged out of the story altogether, in a single deafening second, and the plan would be left running with no one at the controls. Chapter 8. The Bomb on the Boat. On a bright August morning in 1979, the engine of the whole house was switched off in a single second. Every summer, Louis Mountbatten went to Ireland. On the wild northwest coast, in County Sligo, stood Classy-born Cassel, a house he loved, looking out over the Atlantic near the little harbour village of Mullaghmore. He had holidayed there for years, and he refused to be frightened away from it, even as the long and bloody conflict in Northern Ireland ground on through the 1970s, even as those around him worried about his safety. He was Lord Mountbatten. He went where he pleased. He would not be told. On the morning of the 27th of August 1979, he took his boat out from Mullaghmore harbour. She was a wooden craft called the Shadow V, a small cabin cruiser of about 28 feet, and the party aboard her went out to check the lobster pots they had set in the calm water. It was a family outing on a fine day. With the old man were members of his family and a young local boy who helped with the boat. The morning was calm and clear, the kind of soft late summer day that draws people down to the water. The bay at Mullaghmore was a gentle place, a working harbour of small boats and lobster pots, about as far from a battlefield as a man could imagine. That was part of why he loved it, and part of why the horror that came was so complete. A place of peace had been chosen precisely because it was a place of peace. They did not know that during the night, the Provisional Irish Republican Army had slipped aboard the unguarded boat and hidden a bomb inside her, a device packed with around 50 pounds of gelignite and fitted with a radio detonator. On the shore, an IRA man named Thomas McMahon watched the little boat move out into the bay, and when she was clear of the harbour, he pressed the switch. The explosion tore the Shadow V to splinters. It was heard for miles. It killed Louis Mountbatten, 79 years old, almost at once. It killed his 14-year-old grandson, Nicholas Knatchbull. It killed the 15-year-old local boy who had gone along to help, Paul Maxwell, a child with no part in any of it. And it fatally injured the Dowager Lady Broborn, Doreen, Nicholas's other grandmother, who died of her wounds the following day. 4 lives, 2 of them children, ended in a single second on a bright summer sea. The warnings had been there for years. Friends and advisors had urged the old man not to keep going back to the same house, on the same coast, at the same time each summer, in the middle of a war. His movements were regular. His holiday was known. Classy-born Cassel stood exposed near a small harbour where anyone might watch a boat come and go. But Louis Mountbatten had spent a lifetime refusing to be frightened, and he refused now. He would not let terror drive him from a place he loved. That courage, or that stubbornness, was entirely in character, and it cost him and 3 others their lives. Thomas McMahon, the man who built and planted the bomb, had slipped away before it went off and was already under arrest for another matter when the explosion tore across the bay. He would be convicted of the murders and become one of the most notorious prisoners of the conflict. But catching him changed nothing that mattered. The old man was gone. The family that had lost a grandfather and a grandson and a grandmother in a single blast would carry the wound for the rest of their lives. And a nation that had thought of Mountbatten as a fixture, a war hero grown old and grand and untouchable, learned in one August 2nd that the violence of Ireland could reach anyone, even him. The choice of target was deliberate, and it was symbolic. Mountbatten was not a serving soldier or a politician with a hand on policy. He was an old man on holiday, but he was also the most famous member of the extended royal family outside the immediate line, a living emblem of the British establishment and the British crown. And by killing him, the Provisional IRA struck at that establishment in the most public way imaginable. It was violence chosen for its meaning as much as its victim, an act designed to say that no one, however grand, was beyond reach. The same day, in a separate and coordinated attack, the IRA killed 18 British soldiers in an ambush at Warren Point. The 27th of August 1979 was one of the darkest days of the entire conflict, and at the centre of the horror was the murder of a man who was cousin, uncle, and mentor to the royal family, a man who had come through a lifetime of wars only to die on a holiday boat. The film should hold this beat plainly and without dwelling on the horror for its own sake. What matters for the story of the house is what was lost in that instant. The man who had made a queen, shaped an heir, saved a fortune into a family, and treated Broadlands as an instrument of his will, was gone. The engine of the whole machine had been switched off, and the machine, as machines do, kept running. Because the plan did not die with the planner. The habits he had built, the trust he had won, the ideas he had planted in the mind of a grieving prince, all of that survived him. Charles was shattered by the loss. He had lost the grandfather he never had, the one man who had always seemed to know what he should do. And now, without that voice, the prince faced the very question the old man had spent years preparing him to answer. It was time to choose a suitable girl, and the man who would have guided the choice was dead. The house by the test still stood. Its master was ashes, and the marriage he had always wanted his great-nephew to make to a suitable, sweet-charactered young girl was about to happen, in the very shadow of his death. Chapter 9. The Grief That Made a Wedding. At the funeral in Westminster Abbey, the heir to the throne read a psalm for the man who had told him how to marry. Lewis Mountbatten had planned his own funeral for years, down to the smallest detail, as a man of his vanity and his sense of history would. It was held on the 5th of September 1979 at Westminster Abbey, the same great church where, 32 years before, he had watched his nephew marry the future queen. The nation mourned a war hero and an elder statesman. The family mourned something more intimate. And in the abbey, among the readings, Prince Charles rose and read Psalm 107, the old words about those who go down to the sea in ships and are delivered from their distress. The heir to the throne, reading scripture for the murdered man who had loved him and shaped him, made an image the whole country understood. Charles had lost his mentor, his confidant, the nearest thing he had to a father who simply liked him. Those who knew him said the grief cut deeper than almost any loss of his life. There was a terrible fitness in the psalm he chose, though the choosing was the old man's own, for Mountbatten had planned his funeral down to the readings years before. Those who go down to the sea in ships, the ancient words run, that do business in great waters. These see the works of the Lord and his wonders in the deep. A sailor's psalm for a sailor's funeral, read by the boy the sailor had made his own. And the man it mourned had died at sea after all, not in the great grey battles of his youth, but in a small wooden boat on a bright morning, checking lobster pots in a quiet Irish bay. The prince read the words steadily, as duty required. What he felt beneath them, those close to him understood. He had lost the one person who had always seemed to know the answer at the exact moment he most needed to be told what to do. What followed has been argued over ever since, and this film will not claim more than the record allows. Within 18 months of the funeral, Charles was engaged. Within 2 years, he was married. And the woman he married was, on the surface, exactly what Edwina Mountbatten had prescribed all those years before, in that letter about wild oats and suitable girls. She was young, she was beautiful, she was gently born and, as the cruel phrase of the old world had it, without a past. She was, in short, the suitable girl. Whether grief hurried him toward the altar, no one can prove, and it would be too neat to say the bomb at Mullaghmore made the marriage. But the shapes fit together with an uncomfortable precision. The old man had spent a decade telling the prince how his life should go. Have your freedom, then marry a sweet young girl the country can love. The old man had died, and the prince, adrift and grieving, set out to do exactly the thing his lost mentor had always told him to do. There was a problem, and its name was the same as it had always been. The woman Charles truly loved was Camilla, now Camilla Parker Bowles, married and a mother, the wife of that same cavalry officer she had chosen while Charles was at sea. The great attachment of his life had never truly ended. It had gone quiet, it had gone underground, but it had not gone away. And the prince, who now went looking for a suitable bride, carried within him a heart that was already, quietly, spoken for. Into this came a young woman named Lady Diana Spencer. She was the daughter of an old aristocratic family, connected at the edges to the royal world, and she seemed, on paper and in person, to answer every requirement of the old man's prescription. She was very young. She was pretty and shy and apparently uncomplicated. She had no scandal attached to her name. She was, the family and the press and the public quickly agreed, ideal. The machinery of a royal courtship began to turn, and it turned fast. The pressure on Charles by this point was immense. He was past 30, the heir to the throne, and the whole country had been waiting for years to see him choose a bride. Newspapers ran their lists of candidates. Every young woman he was seen with was examined and dismissed. And the one voice that might have steadied him, the great uncle who had guided every important decision of his life, had been silenced on a boat in Ireland. Charles faced the largest choice a man in his position ever makes without the mentor who had spent a decade telling him how to make it. Perhaps that is why the choice, when it came, followed the old man's prescription so exactly. Deprived of the guide, the prince reached for the guidance the guide had left behind. The letter, the code, the picture of the suitable, sweet young girl the country could love. He would do the thing Mountbatten had always told him to do. He would marry the ideal bride. And the fact that his heart was elsewhere, that it had never truly left the woman he had known in the early 70s, was a truth he had been taught to keep in a separate room, out of sight. The way the house he loved had always kept its truths. It was the great mistake of his life, and he walked into it half-blind, grieving, dutiful, following a dead man's map. The suitable girl would become a wife and a mother, and in time the most famous woman in the world, and the marriage the old man's code had built would become the most closely watched failure in the history of the family. And when the moment came to marry, when the wedding was done and the honeymoon began, the young couple would go to the house where royal marriages were made. They would go to Broadlands. They would sleep in the rooms where Charles's own parents had begun a marriage that lasted a lifetime. They would reach for the blessing the house had given once before, hoping the magic would take again. The dead man's house would try, one last time, to make a marriage hold. And this time, The rooms would give nothing back. Chapter 10. The Same Rooms. In August 1981, a new bride was brought to the exact house where the last royal marriage had begun. The wedding came first, and it was the grandest spectacle the monarchy had staged in living memory. On the 29th of July 1981, at St. Paul's Cathedral, Charles married Lady Diana Spencer before a global television audience counted in the hundreds of millions. She was 20 years old. She wore a dress with a train that seemed to fill the aisle. The crowds filled London as they had filled it for his mother, and the fairy tale, that dangerous word, was spoken everywhere. A shy young girl had become a princess before the eyes of the world. The country threw itself into the day as it had thrown itself into that earlier wedding in 1947, and for many of the same reasons. Britain, in the summer of 1981, was uneasy and divided, its cities tense, its mood low. And here again was a royal wedding offered as a moment of light, a fairy tale to set against the hard news, a young couple on the steps of a cathedral, with the crowds roaring and the bells ringing across London. The parallel with his parents' wedding was not lost on anyone. The nation had been here before, and it wanted the same happy ending. And then, as his parents had done 34 years before, the newlyweds went to Broadlands. The choice was made on purpose, and everyone understood the meaning of it. They travelled by royal train down to Hampshire, to the house by the Test, and there they spent the first days of their marriage, about 3 of them, in the rooms where Elizabeth and Philip had begun a union that was still, in 1981, going strong after more than 3 decades. It was a deliberate echo, a reaching back for a proven charm. The family went to Broadlands because Broadlands was where a great marriage was supposed to start. The house had launched a queen. Perhaps it could launch a princess. From Broadlands, the honeymoon moved on. The couple flew to Gibraltar and boarded the royal yacht Britannia for a long cruise through the Mediterranean. Days of sun and blue water and privacy, of a kind the house could no longer fully provide. Then, at the end, they went north to Balmoral in the Scottish Highlands to join the rest of the royal family, as royal honeymoons traditionally closed. On paper, it was a fairy tale honeymoon, the most watched marriage on earth, begun in the luckiest house in the family's memory and carried across a shining sea. And almost none of it was as it seemed. Because behind the fairy tale, by Diana's own later account, the young bride was already deeply unhappy. In the years that followed, she would speak openly of how early the trouble began, of feeling isolated and unprepared, and of a third presence in the marriage that never went away. "There were 3 of us in this marriage," she would famously say, meaning herself, her husband, and the woman he had never stopped loving. The gap between the public fairy tale and the private reality, the very gap this house had always specialized in hiding, had opened beneath her almost from the start. She was 20 years old, plucked from an ordinary young woman's life, and set down inside the most scrutinized marriage on earth, wed to a man 12 years her senior, whose heart, she was coming to understand, was not fully hers to win. The machinery of royal life closed around her, formal, rigid, unfamiliar, and there was no one to teach her how to live inside it. And over everything, from the very beginning, hung the shadow of Camilla, the woman the house had once sheltered, the attachment that had gone quiet but had never truly died. The rooms at Broadlands, the lucky rooms, the blessed rooms that had launched a queen, worked no magic at all this time. Whatever charm the family believed the house could lend a marriage, it could not lend it here. The building offered the same walls, the same park, the same trained silence it had offered in 1947. But the two people it sheltered now were not the two people it had sheltered then, and no house on earth can make a marriage out of a match that was wrong from the start. And the deepest irony sat in the choice itself. They had come to Broadlands on purpose, reaching back 34 years to borrow the luck of a marriage that worked. But luck is not a property of rooms. The house had given Elizabeth and Philip a quiet place to begin, and they had done the rest themselves over a lifetime. Charles and Diana were given the identical quiet place and brought nothing to it that could last. The rooms were the same, the people were not, and the people were everything. A house can lend a couple privacy and beauty and a famous precedent. It cannot lend them a marriage, and it never could. The symmetry is cruel. Two royal honeymoons began in the same house, in the same rooms, 34 years apart. The first, in 1947, launched a marriage that lasted until death parted it more than 70 years later. The second, in 1981, launched the most public marital catastrophe in the modern history of the monarchy. Same house, same rooms, same reaching for a blessing. And two more opposite fates are hard to imagine. The house had done its part. It had offered the rooms and the precedent and the quiet, and it had asked, as it always did, only that the people inside it play their parts. But a house cannot make two people love each other. It can only hold the space where they try. And in the summer of 1981, in the rooms that had blessed a queen, two people who could not save their marriage began the slow public business of losing it. The blessing had failed. The rest was only a matter of time, and the time would be measured in years of misery played out before the largest audience any royal marriage had ever known. Chapter 11. The blessing that would not take. The house had made this kind of magic before, but this time the rooms gave nothing back. What followed the honeymoon has been told and retold until it has become one of the defining stories of the age, so the film need only trace its shape. The marriage begun at Broadlands in 1981 did not fail slowly and quietly. It failed loudly, publicly, catastrophically, played out across the front pages of the world for more than a decade. The pressures came from every side. There was the age gap and the gap in temperament between a serious, set older man and a young woman still forming who she was. There was Diana's growing awareness of Camilla, the third presence in the marriage that had never truly left. There was the crushing weight of public attention, and here the film returns to a thread it planted long before. Recall the crowds at Broadlands in 1947, the sightseers climbing and jostling at Romsey to glimpse a princess on her honeymoon. That was the public eye leaning against the walls, clumsy and human and on foot. By 1981 and the years that followed, that eye had become something else entirely. It had become a global industry, armed with long lenses and helicopters and an appetite that never slept, worth fortunes to those who fed it. The privacy that a great house and a fortune had once been able to buy, the privacy that had made Broadlands so useful an instrument, no longer existed at any price. The world could no longer be kept at the gate. It had come over the walls, and it followed the Princess of Wales everywhere she went for the rest of her life. This is the deep change the house lived through, bracketed by its two royal honeymoons. In 1947, a great private estate and a powerful man could still, more or less, keep the world at the gate. Privacy could be bought, and Broadlands had it to sell. By 1981, that was no longer true at any price. The appetite of the global press had grown into something no wall could hold and no fortune could buy off, and the very thing that had made Broadlands so useful an instrument, its power to hide, had quietly expired. the house could still offer beautiful rooms and a lovely park. What it could no longer offer was the one thing it had always truly sold, which was the ability to disappear. The numbers give the scale. The wedding of 1981 drew a television audience estimated at 750 million people across the globe, one of the largest audiences for any event in human history to that point. When the marriage began to fail, that same colossal audience turned to watch the failure. Every rumour, every cold glance, every unhappy holiday became global news. A marriage that a century earlier could have quietly died behind the columns of a country house now died on live television in front of a substantial fraction of the human race. And through it, the contrast with the earlier marriage sharpened into something almost unbearable. Elizabeth and Philip, married from the same house, had built a partnership that held for a lifetime through every strain a public life could bring. Charles and Diana, married from the same house, in the same rooms, in deliberate imitation, could not hold their marriage together for even a decade. The house had given both couples the identical gift, the lucky rooms, the borrowed blessing. One marriage took it and lived. The other could not, and the world watched it fail. The psychology of the two people trapped inside it is the heart of the tragedy, and the film should give it room. Charles was a man who had been told, by the person he trusted most, that he might indulge his heart and then set it aside for duty. He had tried to do exactly that, and found that a heart set aside does not stay quiet. Diana was a young woman who had believed the fairy tale the world sold her, and who discovered on her honeymoon that she had married into a story already written, with a part in it she had never been shown. She had wanted to be loved. She found instead that she had been cast, and that the role came with a rival written into it from the very first page. Two people, each in their own way, betrayed by the machinery of a suitable royal marriage, and neither of them able to make it right. And the machinery had a designer, even if he was long dead. The suitable marriage, the young, untouched bride, the heart kept in reserve for later, all of it traced back to a philosophy the old man had preached in that Hampshire house and set down in that letter. Mountbatten had believed a prince could take his pleasure and then marry to order, and that the marriage would hold because marriages of that kind were supposed to hold. He had built his own life on a version of that bargain and made it work behind the walls of Broadlands. What he had not reckoned with was a couple who could not live the lie as smoothly as he had, in an age that would no longer let them hide it. The old man who had built the machine was 2 years dead when the honeymoon began. He never saw the marriage he had, in a sense, prescribed. He never saw the rooms fail. He had believed all his life that a dynasty could be arranged, that with money enough and cleverness enough and the right rooms, human hearts could be set in their proper places and made to hold. Broadlands was the proof of his faith, the house that money had saved, the house that had launched a queen. And Broadlands was about to become the proof of how wrong he was. Because the marriage begun in its rooms would end, and its ending would be one of the most painful public spectacles of the century, and the house that had staged the beginning would stand serene through all of it, changing nothing, saving no one, simply enduring by the river as it always had. Chapter 12. Every marriage the house had made. One by one, the unions arranged, sheltered or staged inside these walls came to their endings. The marriage of Charles and Diana limped on through the 1980s into the 1990s, a public performance of a private ruin. There were children, 2 sons, and there were long stretches where the show held together for the cameras. But behind it, the marriage was dead, and both partners had turned elsewhere. In 1992, the separation of the Prince and Princess of Wales was formally announced. The fairy tale, so relentlessly sold to the world in 1981, was over in the eyes of everyone. The divorce followed in 1996, ending the marriage that had begun with such spectacle 15 years earlier. And then, in 1997, came the ending no one was prepared for. Diana, Princess of Wales, no longer a royal wife but more famous than ever, was killed in a car crash in Paris, chased into a tunnel by the very machinery of public attention that had hunted her since the day her honeymoon began. She was 36 years old. The world's grief was enormous and strange, a public mourning for a woman most of the mourners had never met, and it shook the monarchy to a degree few crises ever had. Set out the ledger of the house now, the tally of the marriages made under one roof. The founding marriage, Louis and Edwina, had been a glittering arrangement behind a public front, held together by will and money rather than love, and ended only by Edwina's death in 1960. The great success, Elizabeth and Philip, begun at Broadlands in 1947, had lasted more than 70 years, the one marriage in the whole story that gave the old man's faith its proof. And the great catastrophe, Charles and Diana, begun in the same rooms in deliberate imitation of that success, had ended in separation, divorce, and death, the most painful royal failure of the age. 3 marriages tied to the house, 1 clear triumph, 2 arrangements that ended in loss. Set the dates side by side, and the pattern is stark. Edwina and Louis, married in 1922, held together until her death in 1960. 38 years of a union that was never quite what it seemed. Elizabeth and Philip, begun at Broadlands in 1947, lasted 73 years, until death alone could end it. Charles and Diana, begun in the same rooms in 1981, were separated within 11 years and divorced within 15, and the marriage was buried, in the end, by a death in a Paris tunnel. The house had stood through all of it, unchanged, while the people who came to it for a blessing walked out into fates as different as a long life and a short one. And there was a 4th thread still to be resolved, the oldest one of all. Camilla, the woman the house had sheltered in the early 1970s, the great attachment that had never truly ended, was still there. Through all the years of the failed marriage, through the separation and the divorce and the death, the bond between Charles and Camilla had endured. It had survived her marriage and his, survived scandal and public fury, survived everything the old man's rules had thrown in its way. And in 2005, at long last, Charles married Camilla. Think of what that means against everything that came before. The old man had lent his house to shelter this attachment in its beginning, while at the same time forbidding it to become a marriage, while lining up a suitable girl and his own granddaughter and a whole dynastic plan instead. The suitable girl had been found, married, and lost in tragedy. The granddaughter had never happened. And the one attachment Mountbatten had treated as a young man's indulgence, to be enjoyed and then set aside, was the one that outlasted all his careful arrangements and became, in the end, a marriage and a queen. The house had sheltered the beginning of the only royal love in this story that actually endured. And it had done so almost by accident, as the private hideaway for an affair the old man never meant to last. Every marriage he arranged on purpose came apart. The one attachment he tolerated as a passing thing was the one that held. It took a long time, and it took a terrible amount of pain. Camilla, too, had married and had children, and lived a whole life alongside the princes, the 2 of them circling each other across the decades, while the arranged marriage he had made came apart in public. When Charles at last married Camilla in 2005, he was a man in his middle 50s, long past the young prince his great-uncle had lectured about wild oats and suitable girls. The suitable girl was dead. The wild oats, it turned out, had been the love of his life all along. and the whole elaborate structure of arrangement the old man had built, the code, the letter, the plan, had achieved the exact opposite of what it intended. It had delayed the true marriage by more than 30 years and buried a young woman in the wreckage on the way. There is a lesson in that, buried in the walls of Broadlands, and it is not the lesson the old man thought he was teaching. Chapter 13. The House That Money Kept. While the marriages ended, the house did the one thing it had always done. It survived. Broadlands still stands. That simple fact is what sets it apart from almost every other subject this channel has ever explored. The great houses of England fell in their thousands across the 20th century, pulled down, burnt out, handed over, subdivided into flats, abandoned to the weather. Broadlands escaped all of it. It remains what it always was, a private family home, lived in, cared for, whole. While so many of its kind became ruins, hotels, schools, or museum pieces surrendered to the state, it survived for the reason it was always going to survive. The Cassel money that Edwina carried through the door in 1922 insulated the house from the century that destroyed its neighbours. While other families were crushed by death duties and falling rents and the long decline of the land, Broadlands had a fortune behind it that the land could never have produced. The house could be saved, and it was saved, again and again, by money made far away in the City of London and the wider world. The house passed down through the Mountbatten family after the old man's death. It went to his elder daughter, Patricia, Countess Mountbatten of Burma, who had survived that terrible day at Mullaghmore, and then down through the Knatchbull and Brabourne line to the descendants who hold it still. The Mountbatten name and the Mountbatten collections remain in the rooms, the naval trophies and imperial mementos and family portraits of a dynasty that sat at the centre of British life for a century. There is a hard courage in that survival worth noting. Patricia, who inherited the house, had been aboard a boat that same summer and had lost her son and her mother-in-law to the bomb at Mullaghmore. She carried the wounds of that day, and she carried the house too, keeping it whole and keeping it a home. The family did not sell up and walk away from a place so marked by grief. They stayed. They kept the doors and the collections and the name, and they went on living in the rooms where so much of the century had been arranged. The house that had survived the wars and the taxes now survived the murder of its master, and it did so because the people who loved it refused to let it become a monument to a single terrible day. And for a short season each summer, usually a stretch of days in August, the doors open. Visitors are let in to see a selection of the ground floor rooms to walk a little way into the world the family made. They see the Capability Brown Park running down to the River Test, the classical serenity, the columns and the water, exactly as generations of the powerful saw them. What they see is the front of the house, the part that was always meant to be seen. The private world above and behind, the world where the marriages were made and unmade, is not on the tour. Stand in that park on an open day in August, and the strangeness of the place settles over you. Everything grand about Broadlands is exactly as it was. The river still slides past the lawns. The portico still faces the water. The house is as beautiful and as calm as it was on the day Edwina brought her fortune through the door, on the day Elizabeth and Philip came as newlyweds, on the day Charles and Diana reached for a blessing that never came. The building has changed almost nothing across the whole span of this story, and everything the building was used to arrange has come apart. The marriages made under this roof are history now, most of them stories of loss. The man who ran the house is more than 40 years in his grave, killed on a summer sea. Edwina is gone, and Diana, and the whole world of certainty the old man believed he could command. The house outlived all of it, serene and indifferent, saving itself as it always had, while the human arrangements inside it failed one after another. This is the quiet paradox at the center of the whole story. The house lived because it had been cut loose from the ordinary fate of great houses, insulated by a city fortune from the depression and the death duties and the demolitions that took its neighbours. It was spared the century, and precisely because it was spared, it endured to witness the failure of nearly everything arranged inside it, the murders and the divorces and the early deaths, standing calm and unchanged through all of it like a beautiful clock that keeps perfect time in a house where nothing else works. Money could hold up the walls. Money could mend the roof and warm the rooms and keep the family in place for another 100 years. But no amount of it could reach inside the marriages the house was used to make. And there, the fortune that saved the building was worth nothing at all. The house could be saved. The people and the marriages they made could not. That is the truth the calm columns have always concealed. And it is the truth the visitors on the August tour walk right past, never shown the rooms where it happened. Chapter 14. The rooms that arranged a century. Stand in the park today, and the house looks like the picture of permanence it always was, and that is the last deception. Along the river test, a pale, classical house stands exactly as it did 2 centuries ago. That was where this story began, with the serenity of the place and the lie the serenity tells. Now at the end, the lie can be named for what it is. Broadlands looks like permanence. It looks like the reward that grandeur and money and old blood earn in the end. A beautiful house that lasts. But permanence of stone is not permanence of anything that matters, and the house has spent a century proving it. Return to what the old man believed. Louis Mountbatten believed, with all the certainty of his restless, brilliant, controlling mind, that a dynasty could be engineered. He believed that marriages could be arranged like alliances, that hearts could be steered like ships, that with money enough and cleverness enough and the right rooms, the future of a family could be built as deliberately as a house is built. He gave his whole life to that belief. He made a queen. He shaped an heir. He saved a fortune into the family and lent his rooms to the making of royal marriages across 2 generations. He was, in his own eyes, the master builder of a century of monarchy. And almost nothing he built by design held. The queen he made was the exception that flattered his faith, a marriage that lasted, begun in his house. But the heir he shaped married the suitable girl and destroyed her and himself in the process. The granddaughter he hoped to place on the throne never came near it. The affair he sheltered as a passing indulgence became the marriage that outlasted all his plans. The man who believed he could arrange human hearts was proved wrong by every heart he tried hardest to arrange, and he did not live to see a single one of the endings. The house knew better all along. A house cannot make 2 people love each other. It can only hold the space where they try and keep their secrets, and stand serene whether they succeed or fail. Broadlands gave every couple the same gift, the same lucky rooms, the same borrowed blessing, and then watched, indifferent, as one marriage lived and the others died. The house had only ever been a witness to marriages, never their maker, dressed up by an ambitious man as something more. And perhaps that is the truest verdict on Louis Mountbatten himself. He was a man of real gifts and real courage, who governed empires and won wars and gave a lonely boy the love he needed. But he could not tell the difference between arranging a life and living one, between the circumstances of a marriage, which he could shape, and the hearts inside it, which he could not. He treated people as pieces because pieces are what a planner understands, and he went to his grave believing the board was his to command. The marriages proved otherwise. Elizabeth and Philip lasted because they loved each other, not because he placed them in the right house. Charles and Diana failed because they did not, and no house could disguise it. The one great love in the story survived by hiding from his plan, not by following it. He never learned this because he did not live long enough. The bomb took him in 1979, 2 years before the second honeymoon began in his rooms. More than 25 years before the true marriage he never sanctioned finally took place. He died certain that the future could be arranged. The house he left behind has spent every year since gently proving him wrong. That is why the house survives, and the arrangements do not. Stone can be insulated from the century by a bank in the city. Roofs can be mended, and rooms kept warm, and a fortune set between a house and ruin. But no fortune, no cleverness, no perfect private rooms can insulate a marriage from the two people inside it. The old man could save the house. He could not save the family. And the deepest irony of Broadlands is that he never understood the difference. So the house stands, and the river runs, and the visitors come for their short season in August and see the beautiful front and go home. They do not see the rooms where a queen began a marriage that held, and a princess began a marriage that shattered in the same walls 34 years apart. They do not see the study where a boy who would be king learned to love the man who would teach him how to lose. They see only the serenity, the columns, the water, the picture of permanence. The house could be saved, the marriages could not. Lewis Mountbatten spent his life refusing to believe those two sentences could both be true, and Broadlands, calm and beautiful and enduring by its slow river, has been quietly proving them true ever since. Before you go, if this story held you, subscribe so the next one finds you. And tell me this in the comments. Do you think Lewis Mountbatten believed he was protecting the family he loved? Or do you think a man who spent his life arranging other people's marriages was only ever arranging his own idea of history? I read them, and I want to know what you think.